Well, good morning. My name's Dallas. I'm pastor here at First Baptist Church of Jackson. It is good to be with you, and it's good to walk in this story of Joseph with you. If you are just jumping into Joseph's story, it has been one of not really a whole lot of twists and turns, more of just descent. He started off in his family as kind of one of the smallest, the youngest of the family. But his father loved him with favoritism and showed him all sorts of kind of special gifts. And it puffed him up and it made all of his brothers angry until they decided to attack him and take him out. And so they sold him into slavery, and he spent years working for the commander of the guard for Pharaoh in Egypt until he's wrongfully accused and he's thrown in prison. And today we hear about the story of what brings him out of prison. There's a literary term which might feel like one of the characters in the story. It's called peripeteia. Sounds a little bit like Potiphar or one of these words, but it's a word for the reversal of fortunes, the turning point. And this story is a turning point in Joseph's story. And I don't know about you, but I feel like there's a lot of anxiety for me around turning points in life. Whenever you've had a major life change, it can seem like amazing things are ahead, and you're still a little anxious. If you are married and you had that kind of like, what was the butterflies before getting married? Is this going to work out or not? Or what will I expect? If you've picked a university for school and you're like, well, is this the right place? Is this the right degree for me? If you've had to make a decision about job changes and which job is the right one and which one's going to be fulfilling, give me the right kind of pay, the right kind of, is this going to be stressful or too stressful? No matter what your life decision is, there's a lot of stress because it could go all sorts of ways. And I think for most of us, we hear the story of Joseph and we only hear the good outcome of like, this just seems like he hit the lottery. And he's going to get a ton of stuff in the story. But I'm going to read us through the story in a few different versions. And we'll take the lottery route first of what amazing kind of like payday, like payoff to this giant journey that Joseph has been on. Here he is, he's been sitting in prison. And prison, I can't imagine you're getting good light. I can't imagine things smell the most amazing. And so when the Pharaoh decides he wants to see you, they've got to prep you because you're not in condition to see Pharaoh yet. Pharaoh wants to see people in a certain condition. And so they have to get him ready. They shave him, they give him new clothes. I'm sure there's some oils involved. Like, let's get some deodorant on you, Joseph, so that when you show up to Pharaoh's court, you will be looking the part and you will be ready to see Pharaoh. And he goes in front of Pharaoh. Part of the weirdness of the story is Joseph makes no weird leaps and like jumps and interpretation of Pharaoh's dream. It feels pretty straightforward, which I think part of the straightforwardness of this dream interpretation is maybe to ridicule the Pharaoh's house and their interpreters. But it's just kind of straightforward. Hey, you had 7 really healthy big cows and then 7 ones that are really skinny. You're going to have 7 years of feasting and then 7 years of famine. And you might decide that you want someone wise to run things for you in these 7 years of famine and feast. And Pharaoh's like, I like your idea. You know what? Who was wise enough to interpret my dream? Why don't we make Joseph the one in charge? And so Pharaoh then has Joseph, he takes a ring off of his hand, probably has a seal on it. It's probably a little bit like a signature capabilities of like, okay, this is Pharaoh's seal. I can sign documents with this thing. People know I've got Pharaoh's authority with this ring. He hands him his ring. And then he gets him fine garments. And Joseph must have really enjoyed the feel of the fine garments. They already had cleaned him up, but he's got even better clothes going on now. Maybe there's a little reminiscing for him about the coat that his dad had given him long ago. Maybe he's reflecting on that, but he's got that nice coat. The nice clothes feel where you're like, oh, this feels nice. This feels expensive. He's got the fine linen coats on today. He's got this fine robe. He's got the ring. He's given the gold chain. I just only hear this now in like in our versions of gold chains. I don't know what kind of visuals to actually assume for ancient Egypt's gold chains, although we do have a good amount of artifacts. You can probably go to a museum and see an example of the type of jewelry that they had. But I'm imagining if this is coming from Pharaoh, we're thinking some of the biggest of jewelry that you can expect in this gold chain. And so he's got his nice gold chain on, he's got his nice clothes on, he's got his ring on, and the next thing you got to do is you got to get a better car. And so he's like, hey, I got a ride for you, Joseph. Let me show you the newest model chariot. Bring in the chariot. I don't know if they can see the chariot from the distance or if he's just saying, hey, trust me, I've got a chariot for you. I don't know what your car of your dreams would be if you're like, okay, the CEO, the president, whoever, like big figure decides to raise your status and they give you an amazing ride, what that ride looks like. But I don't think it quite relates. I read a story, I don't know if you've seen how, this is just the way competition goes. With proms, there's this competition of like, I have to one up the other person and I have to show that I am the best person here. And I'm gonna bring my date to prom in the best car possible. So forget the regular limo. Let's do a Hummer limo, or let's do some other kind of vehicle. I have a friend who rented a Lamborghini for his prom date. And the prom date did not like the color of underglow on the Lamborghini. It's a tough world out there to make an impression. But I read another story of someone that drove a tank to prom. And I don't even know what situation this could be. And I sure hope that they had the okay with their government on driving this tank to prom. But I think a tank is a better imagery of like showing up of like a chariot is not just a ride. It is a power symbol. It is a weapon of war. It is a status symbol. And so he's like, I've got this chariot for you. And so he's got his ring and his robe and he's got his chain and he's got his chariot. And he's like, hey, not just that, everyone will bow to you. You will be the one with authority. Only I will have more authority than you. And I don't know, there's some things that you don't know how to put a price tag on. Like, how much does it cost to get everybody to bow their knee to you? I know that there's billionaires out there have figured out the cost analysis on that, of what does it take to buy politicians or judges or whoever, of like, somehow they make price evaluations of things that we would never even think of. But for Joseph, here's the kind of authority you have. Everybody has to get out of your way. They won't do anything without your consent. And it doesn't stop there. He's like, okay, Joseph, you know what? We need to do some better branding for you, Joseph. You're not going to run out there as authoritarian and rule over Egypt as Joseph. Let me get you a new name, Zaphanath-Paneah. That'll work for our crowd. So Joseph's not good enough. Let's go Zaphanath-Paneah. That's your name from now on. And you know what? You're going to want the right status symbol. You know what? You're 30 years old. We've seen his story go from 17 to 30, a lot of it in solitary kind of like prison confinement, and sometimes being harassed by Potiphar's wife. I don't know about you, sometimes people under confinement and they're suddenly free, they might want to start a new relationship. And Pharaoh's like, I've got you on this one. Let me arrange a marriage for you. You're going to marry Potiphar's daughter, Asenath. Potiphar is a priest of an area that's kind of known as a great seer. They're like a high status priest in the region. So I got you a great wife. I got you a great name. I got you a great ride. I got you great clothes. This is going to be great. And so Joseph takes on this new identity. He's completely transformed. There's a reason later in the story when his brothers show up, they don't recognize him at all. The end of the story is not Joseph, it's Zaphanath-Paneah. And as he's going through those things, he's doing his job. He's collecting the grains. He's trying to administer how to like survive the famine that's coming. And in the midst of that, he has two kids. He names the first one Manasseh and the second one Ephraim because he's able to forget all of the misfortunes he's been going through, and he's excited that God has made him fruitful in this land. And so Joseph, if we can still call him Joseph at the end of this story, has moved on from his past self and is living big in Egypt, so much so that he's helping them collect all of the food in Egypt, so much so that it says that they just stopped counting. I don't know what that's like when you're looking at your bank account, you're like, I can just stop counting, right? It's just like, hey, we don't have to worry about this anymore. Just assume it's huge. And so that can feel like Joseph just completely hit the lottery. He went from prisoner to being top 5 economic people in the entire world at the time. I mean, there's not too many countries vying with Egypt in power. But we can look at this story from another angle. Let's go the opposite angle. So we went really big fortune. He lucked out, jackpot, perfect. Let's go the worst angle you can take on this. Maybe Joseph sold his soul in this story. Maybe Joseph walked in and he's like, okay, you know, I've been following God and everything keeps falling apart around me. And I still am going to trust you, God, but I kind of like this idea of getting in good with the Pharaoh. We saw that last week. The Pharaoh had sent his servants into prison just because they were offensive to him. And presumably at the end of our story, Joseph can do that to other people now. He can just throw people into prison. We'll see that later. He gets that kind of authority. And you can just decide, I don't like you today, I'm going to throw you in jail. And he decides to just kind of throw one servant in jail or kill one servant, let the other servant go back to work. And that's the kind of power Pharaoh wields. And Joseph decides, that's the guy I want to get close to in life. Let me be close to him. That guy has a lot of power. I want to get close to it. And in this story, when he gets word that Pharaoh wants to hear about, maybe you can interpret his dream for him. Joseph doesn't start transforming into a new person after he meets Pharaoh. Before he even gets to Pharaoh, he's like, you know what? Yep, I'll shave. And the kind of Egyptian styling would have been to have like no beard and no hair, just shave your whole head. And that's kind of their custom. If you know much about Old Testament laws, that's not a Jewish way of doing facial hair and not a Jewish way of doing hair. And so this idea of let's just shave it all off, let's just start over, be fresh. I'm going to show up like an Egyptian as best I can. He's kind of giving up a part of his identity before he's even entered into the room with Pharaoh. And he goes into Pharaoh's house, he interprets the dream, and suddenly he gets success offered to him. And he's like, yeah, I don't need this name. Okay, sure, I'll be this new name. Do you want to marry this other, woman that's the daughter of this other priest? She's like, okay, sure. And obviously the Old Testament's pretty rough on some of this marriage topics and who they marry and what's going on in this. But I think there's a little hint of the fact that she's a daughter of a priest of another religion that's meant to be a little bit like, maybe this isn't the best idea for Joseph. And so maybe he's kind of giving up himself. And at the end of the story, whenever he starts having kids, and he's like, you know what? I want to forget things. And what does he want to forget? He wants to forget his father's house. He's like, I want nothing to do with my background and my heritage. I'm moving on. I'm excited to be fruitful in the new place, but I can't be that person I used to be. I don't know about you, but there are certain people that have been kind of put in spotlight that you can kind of see their transformation over time. People that seem like very coherent, logical, well-spoken, and then they get told what to say for long enough. They keep giving scripted things and they keep having to say points that maybe they don't necessarily agree with. And at some point they lose themselves and they become puppets. They become shells of them former selves. And then you see them decades later and you're like, who is this person? They used to have this charisma and power and strength. And suddenly I don't recognize that person. I mentioned last week the kind of famous version of how power can corrupt the J.R.R. Tolkien example of Gollum in Lord of the Rings, that this thing that gives you some strength and power that's exciting, and you don't know over time that it's reshaping you and you're transforming into something that you weren't. So maybe Joseph lost himself in the story. Give me a middle ground. I'm not going to answer for you what you have to assume, that this story is about, because I think that it being open to interpretation is good. But perhaps Joseph is done with some things that he needed to be done with in his life. Joseph had not been treated very well by his brothers. Certainly some of that he had some blame in, but not in being thrown into slavery, not in being mistreated that way, not in being thrown into Egypt and prisons. He tried to work as well as he could for Potiphar, and then Potiphar's wife just wouldn't leave him alone until he's thrown in jail. And now he's like, okay, I've got one opportunity. Maybe I'm just going to be stuck in jail for the rest of my life. I got one opportunity. I got to make an impression with Pharaoh. I'll do whatever I can to get out of the situation. But what Joseph does throughout it is when people ask him about their dreams, he always tells them, well, dreams belong to God, and God can interpret this. There's something little like technical that's happening in the Hebrew of the Old Testament here. When Joseph talks about God in this chapter, he keeps saying the God with a definite article. Well, the God will speak favorably to you, to you, Pharaoh. He was very optimistic that God's interpretation to Pharaoh before he hears the dream is God's going to be favorable to you. He said, God, please help me out, God. We need a favorable impression for Pharaoh, but the God will answer you. Now, Egypt has lots of gods in their kind of theological outlook and perspective. And so when Pharaoh would go back and forth with Joseph, he would go back and say, well, I get it. God does this or that. God does this or that. And Joseph's like, no, the God will give you an interpretation. So there's a little bit back and forth play on the God or just a God. But Joseph clings to God, but seems to give up the rest of himself. Well, his family named him. His family mistreated him. And there's an element in the story of maybe Joseph's being able to get past that trauma in the best way that he can at the time, which is, I'm going to move forward. I'm not just going to sit and wallow in a prison forever. I'm going to move out of this place. I'm going to be fruitful again. He's not necessarily going to be fully healed yet. We got a lot more left in the story. But he's like, I will trust in God. God will interpret. God will get me out of this. God will be favorable. And I'm going to cling to God and give up everything else. So maybe Joseph has sold something. Maybe it's his past self. Maybe it's the customs of his family, his traditions, his history. But he's moving forward into a new self and a new life. And I think about how tricky it is for us to navigate some of these things. You might, if you kind of enter into a new work situation or a new friendship, or you get married and you have new in-laws, you enter into these spaces where people have a lot of expectations about you. And whether you're thinking about it or not, you have to decide, am I showing up as me, or do I want to redefine myself now into this new space? Do I present as I've always been, or do I make a new name for myself? And I mentioned several weeks back about a feeling I had on some of our visits that we had while we were out of town. There were some church environments that people were very nice, but I didn't feel like I belonged. There was a weird disconnect. And I want to maybe say a little bit about that. Maybe you can find yourself in that story. There's some environments where as long as you fit the box we want for you, you are welcome. The moment you start pushing that box, suddenly the tensions are different, the behaviors are different. And it's like, as long as you fit my box, we're so glad to have you. And there was this weird, quick questionnaire that happens where you walk up and they're wanting to make sure you fit the good old boys club is kind of what they're wanting you to do. Ask you a couple questions. And they're like, oh, you know what? You fit right in. You're great. We're so glad to have you. But if the whole time you're like, I know that if you actually knew me, maybe you wouldn't welcome me. Maybe I don't belong. And seeing how often whenever people want to make who belongs really tight and really close and only a few people can fit, what happens is you have this tension of like, do I present myself in a way that will make them feel like I'm one of them and they'll be happy and they'll be nice to me, but you'll feel awful about yourself. It's like, why should I have to hide who I am, what I believe, how I think? And so we face this constant struggle. I don't think I've met a single church anywhere that has not had this vantage point where they say, we would love for there to be more younger people in this church. Or another version, we would love to have a better kind of racial or economic diversity. We want more people that aren't like us. But there's still this unwritten rule, though, like when you come in, you need to be like us, though. I saw a really bizarrely honest and straightforward church info sign. They were writing about themselves to other churches, and they said their style of worship was a 1930s style of worship. And at first I was like, I've never even heard of like that era specifically as like, this is what we do. And I was like, man, I've never heard anybody like idolize the Depression, but we're 1930s style worship place. And we would love to get new people who help us in our 1930s style worship. And you're like, oh, wow. Like, at least they are honest, because most of us don't want to be honest. You're like, no, like, I want the new people, but you must be exactly how I want you to be. And so we'll ask Josephs when they come in our doors to say, can you change your name a little bit? Can you dress a little differently? Can you clean up a little bit more? And we're so easy to like quickly judge people, and it's tough. And so we struggle with, do we force people to assimilate or do people belong? There's some letter correspondence that I find interesting from the early 1900s. There was a man named Israel Zangwill who wrote back and forth with President Teddy Roosevelt. They would send pictures to each other of family. They would write back and forth. And Israel was born in the 1860s of Jewish immigrant parents who had kind of left Poland and kind of Russia. And they kind of migrated over to the United States. And Israel made a play which was called The Melting Pot, The Great American Dream. And it's kind of where the famous idea of the melting pot kind of really originates. And so Zangwill writes, America is God's crucible, the great melting pot, where all of these people come and they melt together in the crucible of God making us all Americans. And for Teddy Roosevelt, he loved this play and he was really positive towards it. And then some other people weren't positive towards it. And they wrote, they gave a different metaphor, which you might have heard also, the one of the salad bowl, that we're together, but we don't have to like force everything to be exactly the same. Maybe we can work together in our unity and yet not disappear the parts that make us unique. But I can't help but thinking that Joseph was melted into Egyptian society in that moment. And that was the only way that they could imagine. Like, well, the rest of Egypt is not going to follow a former Hebrew slave. You got to have a new name, a new identity. And I think about, what is it for us to go forward? Like, do we get to hold anything about ourselves, our past lives, or are we all being melded into something uniformly? And so I was thinking about what is it to be assimilated into God's kingdom? Now, one of my favorite images in the New Testament is that Peter has this dream, talking about Joseph and dreams. Peter had this dream about the food is all clean. And he's wrestling with this dream. And then suddenly some Gentiles, some non-Jews show up and they ask him to go over to their house. And he goes over to their house. And Peter's probably still processing, what is going on? Is God saying these people are clean or not? And it says that they don't let Peter stop preaching. They just go ahead and say, hey, can we be baptized? What would prevent us from being baptized? And Peter's like, I guess nothing. And they're baptized right then and there. Peter had not thought through, do you need to become circumcised? Do you need to become a Jew? Do you need to have these practices? They just saw God at work in these people and said, we're baptizing you. I see it. I recognize God's Spirit in you. And then Peter's got to go explain it to some people later. And it's not easy to explain later because people are like, you know what? We kind of want them to look more like us though, right? But God's Spirit was in them. But don't we want them to look like us? And so I think about how some of us have heard the verse of Jesus when he says, if any of you wish to come after me, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? And you think about, oh, I must deny myself. Maybe none of myself matters. And all I have to do is God will have some new identity for me, completely cut off from my past self. And I just want to take on the new life, act like the other thing didn't happen, forget myself. But Jesus says that line about denying yourself right after Peter opposed the news that Jesus was going to the cross. And so Peter was like, I want to do a different plan than God's. And Jesus is telling him, hey, sometimes we have to deny our own plans. Those things that we want, some of those things have to go away for God's greater plans. And your plans might be a hindrance here. But what is it for us to walk into God's throne room, to put on new garments that God has for us? Do we lose our old selves? Do we keep it? And I want to just leave you with one image. One of my favorite images of the whole Bible. The Bible begins with the garden in paradise in Eden, and it ends with the garden returned. But the garden returns in Revelation as an urban garden. Suddenly there's a city around it, and there's walls, and there's civilization, and there's streets of jewels. And there's something really affirming to me that God doesn't look at all of our history and say, you guys messed this up so bad, let's go back to square one. Instead, he invites them in the midst of our civilization to find a place where we're in a dance with God and we end up in some new thing, but we return to God's initial imaginations for who we can be in the midst of all of that. And so today I want to invite you to reflect on, who is God calling you to be? What are parts of yourself that maybe you've let go of, that maybe you could champion a new way of talking about? Paul never acted like he didn't have a bad past. Paul kept that around to talk about how God's transforming power had been at work in his life. He didn't just forget his life. He used it as a witness and as a tool. So maybe some of us have a past life that we've wanted to hide and keep it away from everybody. And maybe there's a good story, a good witness, a good testimony that we can bring out of who God is in the midst of our lives. Maybe for some of us, we've had God inviting us into something new, and we've wanted to just kind of like, I want to stay in my little dungeon cell that's nice and cozy. I know it's not great. Nothing's great. But I'm too afraid to get out of this thing. And sometimes God invites us to be free of some things and to be liberated from some things, and yet we're too afraid of what might go wrong. And so maybe we might take some courage, like Joseph, to go out into this new thing and to say, I haven't heard the dream yet, God, but I am going to trust that it's going to be favorable today. So maybe some of us that are a little bit more skeptical, a little bit more pessimistic, might find some optimism and hope with God. What I hope for us all is, like Joseph in the story, that no matter what is going on around us, that we might not give up talking about God's role in our lives. I would imagine a lot of people before the scene in Joseph's life would not think God has been very good to Joseph. But God has been around with Joseph. Joseph has continually talked about God. And he's going to continue to talk about God, even though his circumstances keep changing in drastic ways. Now, it's up for us to go off with new garments, new robes, new lives, new names. You know, if we take on a new identity in God, if we do that, it's on us to continue to hold tight to God, to hold to his love, to extend it to others. And we'll see whether Joseph runs in good ways or bad ways with his new identity. But Joseph is a new person now, Zaphanath Paneah. He's given a new name. And so today, if you are someone who has been struggling with, I just want to get out of being kind of stuck in the messiness or the murkiness of whatever you're going through, I hope for you can imagine God bringing you out of that cell and inviting you to get cleaned up, put on new robes, and start a new, fresh day. And for some of us, maybe we've had some great opportunities, and I want to invite you to not forget who you are, but especially don't forget who God is in the midst of those good things. Because in the midst of raises and promotions and the jackpots of life, it can be easy to forget God in the midst of that. So let us not forget God on that journey. And so, who knows where we all are in the midst of our transformations, of our metamorphoses, but this is a space to reflect on that and reflect on your journey with God and where God is leading you. And so I just want to say a word of prayer and invite you to reflect on what God is doing in your life right now. Lord God, we thank you so much for the blessings of our lives, even in the midst of famines. We know that you have been good to us through all things, even when it is sometimes hard to see with our nearsightedness. Lord, we ask for your wisdom to know what is from you and what things about our lives we can share and reflect and celebrate about what you have been up to in our world and our lives. We ask that we might let go of the things that have held us down, that have caused us not to love or to hate, and we might put those clothes away and be wrapped in your love so that everyone who encounters us might know your love through us. Lord, we thank you that you can make us new. We thank you that you look at us in our current state, not with judgment or shame, but with love. We thank you, Lord. It's in your name we pray. Amen.